Hello, my name is Moylan and I'm an associate editor and a member of the editorial board of Rethinking Marxism. And I'm here to introduce our inaugural lecture, our inaugural Julie Graham Memorial Lecture. Before we get started, I just have a couple of things that I was asked to do. One thing is this conference is sponsored, of course, by Rethinking Marxism. So I wanted to take just a moment to encourage all of you to think about taking those presentations, all of those papers that you all have been working on, and think about submitting them to the journal. That would, if you have any questions about doing that or about the submission process, please grab any one of the many editorial board members that you see floating around. There's four right here. There's Kenna. There's Peter Ives over there in the corner. There's lots of people. So please grab us at any point during the conference and talk to us. And we would love to see these papers make their way into the pages of the journal. And we will work with you to make that happen. One other thing that I'd like to just briefly talk about is that this is a very important year for our journal, for Rethinking Marxism. We are seeing an editorial transition between S. Charushila, who actually couldn't be here with us tonight because she had a family emergency, but she has been our chief editor since 2010. And this year she stepped down, she, in her 4 years, she really helped shepherd the journal through a lot of important internal transformations, such as helping create the change to web-based submissions and creating a structure that trained and brought on associate editors for the first time. So we'd just like to take a moment to thank her for all of her incredible work, for being the chief editor. And I'd also like to thank our incoming editors. Sarah Kayatkin, where are you? Maybe we could, sorry, hey, okay, there you are. And Marcus Green, where are you? Okay, sorry. But despite a very tumultuous summer for the both of them, Serap moving to a new job in Izmir and Marcus becoming a first-time father, this summer they also saw us, they also became co-editors of the journal. And this has been a very smooth transition. And I can say from a sort of insider's position that they are doing this job so well that it seems like they've been doing it for years. And I don't know what's in store for the journal, but I'm very confident that they are the right partnership to guide us through the next 4 years, and maybe more. So, yeah. We are very lucky to have with us tonight Katherine Gibson, one half of the J.K. Gibson Graham that changed the conversations within the Association for Economic and Social Analysis, as well as Rethinking Marxism, as well as many other arenas, for sure, within economic geography, human geography. She is here tonight to present the inaugural Julie Graham Memorial Lecture. Maybe I'll just take one brief moment. The first time I met Julie was, I was a research assistant helping organize a conference at UMass, and it was in this building, well, actually, sorry, the other building, and there was this party going on, and I walk in, it was at the end of the conference, and here was this very striking, tall, red-headed woman who was dancing like no one was watching, really. I remember thinking, wow, this is going to be a very different type of professor than I have ever met before. And that was certainly the case. Many of us who came in contact with her, if you knew her personally, you know how she called her students, but pretty much everyone, sweetie, honey, sweetheart, even when she was telling us something we might not want to hear. For my part, I remember her coming to dinner parties and really being the life of the party. She was uncommon in many respects, but her intellectual life and unique theoretical contributions demand attention. That is what we wish to celebrate here tonight. Let me just say a few words about the work of J.K. Gibson Graham. Reading The End of Capitalism as We Knew It, a feminist critique of political economy, transformed my understanding of both class analysis and feminism. This came soon on the heels of having experienced, and I do think that that's the appropriate word for that word, for both that book and Knowledge and Class, because to read both of those books wasn't just to read, but to experience the world differently. I remembered speaking with Jaren, actually. I was about halfway, well, she had started the book before me, and so she was a little bit ahead of me in the book. And at some point I just had to talk to someone else who had read this book, and we both totally geeked out and admitted that we had started sleeping with this book under our pillow. And the copy of the book that I actually have was Yaya's, one that I borrowed and never returned, and kindly he let me steal that from him. To read The End of Capitalism was to suddenly create a shift in the ground, to allow for economic difference as a simultaneous ontological condition rather than a historical trend of stagism. Through a variety of participatory or community action research projects, they explored the effects of different representations in terms of how they open up economic possibilities inside real communities. Bringing together local community members, workers, academics, and other local professionals, Gibson Graham undertook such projects, these participatory action research projects, in Western Massachusetts, Australia's Latrobe Valley, the Bohol province in the Philippines, and gave generously of themselves to countless other projects all over the world seeking to replicate their methodology, including a participatory action research project that I organized in New Jersey. They are very generous. All you have to do is ask them, and they will give of themselves. They have contributed to the formation and life of institutions such as Unlad Kabayan, which formed a savings group that seeks to invest in non-capitalist firms in the Philippines. They have had close collaborations with community organizations such as Nuestras Raíces in Holyoke, Massachusetts, and with many worker cooperatives such as Collective Copies right here in Amherst. Julie and Kath never saw scholarship as an extractive industry, and in fact trained generations of students to think about the ethical dimensions and obligations of scholarship. Quite simply, Julie and Kath were and are organic intellectuals, and their theoretical work has and continues to provide inspiration. Since Julie's death, Kath Gibson has been continuing and expanding the work that she and Julie shared. Tonight she's going to actually give a lecture that is part of a symposium edited by Esra Erdan over there, which is a wonderful symposium that's going to be coming out in 2 issues, this and the subsequent issue of RM. And the symposium is full of contributions from students of Julie's and collaborators. So I urge you all to see that work, especially because Julie's probably going to be referring to some of it in her talk tonight. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. Big slip there, so very sorry. Kath is currently professor at the Institute of Culture and Society at the University of Western Sydney. She has also played a major organizing role in the formation of the Community Economies Collective, a network of researchers across the US, Europe, Asia, and Australia. And she's really sort of helped maintained that collective in the wake of Julie's death, and reached out to many of her students who, were quite frankly pretty lost after her death. Most recently, she organized a 2-week writing seminar that brought together researchers from the Community Economies Collective at different stages of their career, and helped sort of guide all of that unruly collective. Not a week has gone by without an invitation for a major lecture from journals, universities all around the world. So we are very fortunate that she has agreed to join us here tonight. Please welcome Katherine Gibson.
Thanks, Maria. So just tell me if this is the right sound. Well, hi everybody. It's both a very sad and an appropriately celebratory kind of occasion to be asked to be giving this inaugural Julie Graham Memorial Lecture. And I think it's probably even sadder to think that it follows last night's inaugural memorial lecture for Steve Resnick. So we've lost 2 wonderful souls in the last few years. I just wanted to acknowledge that. So first, I want to express my heartfelt thanks to the organising committee for inviting me to do this. Giving a plenary at a Rethinking Marxism conference, gala conference as you call them here, is a great honour, and to me it's a big deal. And my mind casts back to the previous 2 such plenaries that were given by J.K. Gibson Graham. The first one in 1992, I think at the first gala, and the other in 2000. 21 years ago, in 1992, it was Julie who was up at the podium, alongside Ernest Mandel, Emmanuel Wallerstein and Nancy Fraser. And to a largely aghast audience, she announced that we were done with waiting for the revolution and had embarked on a project of smashing capitalism while working at home in our spare time. Well, while Julie valiantly rehearsed the central argument of what was to become a few years later our first book, The End of Capitalism as We Knew It, a feminist critique of political economy, all the stress of holding up a mirror to radical economic analysis and identifying the debilitating political effects of its capitalocentrism as we saw it was concentrated in her mute collaborator. I remember sitting somewhere here in this audience, unable to breathe, my stomach in a knot with a splitting headache. In 2000, it was totally a different event. It was a much more pleasurable one for both of us. Together, we presented our vision of class enchantment, using clips from the British films The Full Monty and Brassed Off, to illustrate different forms of economic subjectivity. And to the refrain of Tom Jones singing I Believe in Miracles, we offered glimpses of a post-capitalist politics for building community economies, foreshadowing our next book, A Post-Capitalist Politics, which was published in 2006. So tonight, in this third appearance, we return to a single speaker representing the collaboration that was and still is J.K. Gibson Graham. And I trust that Julie's spirit is lurking around somewhere here, hopefully not with its stomach in a knot, as I reflect on where our thinking and research on politics has moved since the mid-2000s. And this time I'll be drawing on our latest book, Take Back the Economy, an ethical guide for transforming our communities, which just came out earlier this year, published by University of Minnesota Press. And this book was conceptualised and begun with Julie before she died in 2010, and it's co-authored with our very dear friends and ex-students, Stephen Healy, who's here somewhere, and Jenny Cameron from Australia. So it's a popular book designed to elicit discussion around ethical interdependence and to provoke conscious and combined efforts to build a new kind of economic reality. So I have a picture here and of Julie, and I'll just get my tissue, David's handkerchief out. And I know I'm a little bit wobbly, so if I really sort of end up in a heap, I just want you all to start singing I Believe in Miracles. Give me a moment to compose myself. Yeah, I have a picture here of Julie for company, and she's at the Cape at her very favourite camping ground run by the Audubon Society. And yes, as she often was, she's on the telephone, connecting with someone in her huge network of friends and colleagues. The telephone was a key player in Julie's life, a technology that was totally part of her, unlike email, which she kind of felt dominated by and railed against. Well, with Julie living in Shutesbury and me in various parts of Australia for the duration of our 33-year friendship, the telephone was certainly an enabler of our joint authorial persona, J.K. Gibson Graham. And it was when international phone calls drastically improved in quality and fell in price with the liberalisation of the telecommunications industry and advances in satellite technology that our collaboration was able to become a weekly and sometimes daily performance. And I think it was the embodied practice of this connection that partly, I'm sure, led to our productivity from the 1990s onwards. So this photo is taken in the Audubon Society's campground with forest all around and the calls of birds in the air, and it reminds me of Julie's great love of nature in all its forms, but especially birds, and particularly the hummies, as she liked to call them, the minuscule ruby-throated hummingbirds that visited the feeders outside her kitchen and bedroom windows every summer on their epic journey from Central America to the northeast of the US. On my visits during the Australian winter and the Massachusetts summer, Julie and I loved to sit with our early morning cups of tea and observe the relentless competition for sweet nectar taking place outside the window screen. Silly young hummies with no thought to predators dallying over the feeder, and then skittish older hummies dive-bombing whoever was at the trough, then hardly taking a slurp before, ever vigilant, they kept on the move. Julie's feeling for these creatures was emotional and deep, and the grief that she expressed when the topic of climate change and species extinction came up was palpable. In the last years of her life, Julie and I became more concerned about how to act in our climate-changing world, the age of the anthropocene, when global warming and species extinction presents threats to life as we've known it, both on our planet and in our economies. Over the 30 or so years of our collaboration, we often return to the question, how do researchers participate in collective actions that will bring other worlds into being? And much of our work has been aimed at opening up ideas about what action is, both by broadening what's considered action under the influence of feminist political imaginaries and strategies, and by refusing the old separation between theory and action. But the coming of the Anthropocene forced us to think more openly about what is the collective that acts. Could we see the telephone and the hummingbirds as part of that collective? And if so, what would it mean for a politics aimed at bringing other worlds into being? To displace humans from the centre of action and to add more than human elements and beings into the collective that acts is certainly a revolutionary move. So in this lecture, I want to think around these kind of matters, and so with a playful nod to that 1992 lecture, I've entitled the presentation, Being the Revolution, or How to Live in a More Than Capitalist World Threatened with Extinction. Of course, while working at home in your spare time. And I'm going to enrol various collaborators in this thinking, and some of them are authors of the special collection that's coming out in the Rethinking Marxism journal that's dedicated to Julie. And others are the authors and the editors of a new book that's coming out called Performing Diverse Economies, that's edited by Kevin St. Martin, who's over there, and Gerda Rolvink from Australia, and J.K. Gibson Graham. So with the telephone and the hummingbirds as my inhuman and non-human guides, I'll attempt to make connections across space, across species, across disparate and unfamiliar concerns. The lecture proceeds with sections discussing the elements and limits of a feminist imaginary of possibility, the synergies between a politics of building community economies and the political imaginary of actor network theory, or what's often called material semiotics. And thirdly, the materiality of emerging community economy assemblages. But I want to start with a story of another camper who has employed technology as a radical actant in search of life, in service of life. Jonathan Moylan, or Jono as he's called, is a 25-year-old translator who grew up in Newcastle, New South Wales, which is the world's largest coal port, a few hours north of Sydney. He's a member of Frontline Action on Coal, an activist group who has set up the first blockade camp of a coal mine in Australia's history. And they're opposing the expansion of open-cut coal mining in the Maules Creek at the Leard State Forest. This is the biggest remnant forest of natural bushland left on the rich Liverpool Plains, part of the state of New South Wales food bowl. In January this year, the protest camp had occupied the bushland site for just over 5 months. And on Monday, January the 7th, Jonathan, sitting in his bushland camp office, used his laptop and mobile phone to issue a fake media release that temporarily wiped out more than $314 million from the value of Whitehaven Coal, a company that plans to extend its mine and clear half of the remaining Laird Forest. The media release announced that the ANZ Bank, which is one of our major investment and consumer banks, had reversed a decision to provide a $1.2 billion loan to Whitehaven Coal to develop the mine. So using a real ANZ statement as a template, a website, and a dummy ANZ email address that he bought for $25 on the internet, Jonathan's media release sparked a sudden shareholder sell-off when it was emailed to journalists around midday. When one newspaper contacted him, Mr. Moylan, as it reported, initially posed as a corporate affairs spokesman for the ANZ Bank. Whitehaven's coal share price dropped by 8%, and it was put into a trading halt. When it was reported the next day in the national press, the story was headed, "Rogue Trader, Hoax Triggers $314 Million Fall." The headline was soon modified to "Environmentalists' Hoax Triggers $314 Million Fall," in a kind of strategic relocation of the actor out of the trading pen and over into the mad externality land of environmentalists. The journalists, of course, focused on Jono the individual, and indeed it's he alone who is being charged and taken to court and potentially faces a 10-year prison sentence for making a false and misleading statement under the Corporations Act. But Jono is part of a much wider hybrid collective that acted on and around January the 17th. His action was inspired, of course, by the Yes Men in the US and also Australia's The Chaser team. And it was part of a coordinated set of protests outside of the ANZ banks all around Australia at that time. In a statement issued to explain why he took such a risk, Jono makes it clear that he's acting in concert with Maules Creek farmers, who have shown a great deal of courage in their attempts to prevent the biggest expansion of the coal industry in New South Wales, as he wrote. All over Australia, and I know in the US and I suspect all over the world, such kind of conservative middle-aged farmers are increasingly joining with more radical green activists across the barriers of demographic and ideological alterity to oppose destruction of farm livelihoods by coal and coal gas seam expansion. But Jono was also acting in friendship with the non-human, defending productive farmland, which is part of Australia's food bowl, protecting other species, especially the grassy box woodland of the Laird Forest, and the koalas who inhabit it. And speaking for the aquifer, which is threatened with contamination, and at the end of mining in 21 years will, according to the company's calculations, be drawn down into a pit lake that will drain the water table for 1,000 years. He's most definitely acting in concert with future generations. As he wrote in his statement in the news that was published in the newspaper, the Iroquois people of North America survived by asking how people 7 generations ahead would be affected by their actions. But here, hundreds of generations will be affected. Beyond these immediate and future collaborators, Jonathan Moylan's action took effect thanks to a much wider socio-technical assemblage that offered a felicitous set of circumstances. His media release was what Judith Butler calls a perlocutionary performative. And she writes, the perlocution implies risk, wager, and the possibility of having an effect, but without any strong probability or strong notion of probability or any possible version of necessity. What acted with Jono were hypervigilant share traders in a nation where over half the adult population owned shares either directly or through managed funds, a media in which the vagaries of financial markets are the bulk of daily reporting, a photocopier that could transfer a corporate letterhead onto a fake press release, wireless internet connections to a remote bushland campsite, laptop technologies, and a national economy that is skewed towards resource extraction and riding high on the massive export markets for Australian coal in China, Japan and India. And of course, a whole swathe of supporters across the country. I once heard Gore Vidal comment in a radio interview that the US in the post-war period was drunk on oil. And this phrase, it spoke to me a lot at the time, but this phrase, somewhat modified, comes to mind now. Australia is drunk on coal. From the employees who suffer horrendous work-life balances in return for the golden handshake that the resource sector rewards them with in the short term, to the mum and dad shareholders whose pension funds are invested in mining companies, to the mining corporations whose grasp on political power in Australia is unprecedented, to the economists who continue to preach the flow-on benefits of resource sector growth, to the climate change sceptics who downplay climate change as forests burn and cities are flooded, to the politicians whose myopia leads them to cancel any responsible action on climate change. We are all drunk on the largesse that coal provides us. Australia rode out the GFC with a resources boom that didn't falter, and any attempt to discuss a post-carbon world is silenced, as we've seen in our recent national elections. So in the face of the coal lobby and all these parties singing from the same sheet, it's instructive to glimpse the failure of market performativity. Under the cover of issuing legitimate market information, the concerns of earth others that are usually externalised and thus ignored were expressed in a language that could be understood. For a brief moment, the hybrid collective for post-coal livelihoods initiated action that had certain effects. So this story helps me, I think, to begin to talk about and think about collective action differently. So what constitutes collective action? We can identify, I think, many answers to this question in the work of Gibson Graham, and I want to review how our thinking on this question evolved and where its potential limits lie. Many of the theoretical interventions that we've made have sprung from a dissatisfaction with the way that political economy re-performs the discursive dominance of capitalism to the detriment of a politics of economic becoming. We proposed that a politics of language had a role to play in any collective action. And our deconstruction of capitalist dominance involved documenting the radical heterogeneity of both capitalist and non-capitalist economic practices that make up our world, and proposing a diverse or more than capitalist economy. The purpose of this inventory was not to lay out a vision of a preferred world, but to explore and to enumerate the vast array of economic practices making up our worlds. And we've used this diverse economy framing or reframing as a step towards opening up the space for different political imaginations. And many of our members of the collective have used this kind of framing to do action research here in the Pioneer Valley. Kevin's used it to work with fishing communities in the northeastern coast of New England. People have used it in the Philippines and Indonesia and elsewhere. In the capitalist economy, or economy as machine imaginary, subjects are confined to a narrow set of roles and motivations. In the field of work, they're subjected to the notion of being an employee who wants, of course, higher and higher wages. In the field of enterprise or business, the subject position as the business owner who wants more and more profits and lower costs, especially wages costs. When it comes to markets, we're all positioned as consumers who want more stuff for less payout. When it comes to property, we're seen as property owners who want higher and higher returns from private property. And in the field of finance, we're investors who want greater private returns from financial investments. Well, the diverse economy framing allows us to identify multiple subject positions, not just those ones, and multiple motivations that coexist in more than capitalist economies. We can identify economic relations shaped not by the so-called laws of motion of capitalist competition, reproduction and accumulation, but by other, more contingent and ethically invested dynamics. And this figure of the iceberg is something we've often used in action research to talk about where people are situated in multiple spaces within economies and the different kinds of investments they have in those spaces. By listening, observing and interacting with people in action research around rethinking the economy, we've come to see the potential for collective actions to build community economies oriented around key ethical concerns. This is the version of the iceberg that's been used in the Pacific, where icebergs don't really resonate, but coconuts do. As our work has evolved, so we've codified these coordinates or concerns of community economies. And in the latest rendition in Take Back the Economy, we reframe these coordinates by taking back and reframing work, reframing business, reframing markets, property and finance. So rather than talking about work, we talk about survival, surviving well. How do we survive well together with human and non-human others? What is the work that we do? How can we combine our different kinds of work practices to survive well? How can we form enterprises that distribute surplus to enrich social and environmental health? So the concern here of the community economy is distributing surplus rather than making profits in business. When it comes to transactions, we're interested in engaging in transactions that allow us to encounter others and in the process of surviving well in a responsible and caring way. How do we encounter others through all the kinds of transactions we're involved in, and how might we do so in a way that supports their well-being as well as ours? When we think about property, we think about the relationships to property that allow us to maintain, replenish and grow our natural and cultural commons. And when we come to thinking about finance, we're interested in financial tools that help us to invest our wealth so that future generations can live well. And in all these concerns around these kind of key areas of economy, we're interested in the idea of consuming sustainably. So the work of building community economies involves making our interdependencies visible and transparently negotiating just, even if very temporarily just, outcomes that recognise and account for difference and otherness. Our provisional ontology of a community economy is premised on an undoing of any known community of common being. Indeed, the work of building community economies involves the unworking of any assumed collectivity and the continual re-performance of the ethical moment when interdependence is negotiated and its layout provisionally settled. As we've written, the community economy is anything but a blueprint. It's an unmapped and uncertain terrain that calls forth exploratory conversations and political and ethical acts of decision. The feminist imaginary of possibility that has inspired Gibson Graham has led us to see the whole world as a stage upon which community economies could be built, and indeed are already being enacted. Ours is a punctiform politics, a vision of disarticulated, place-based movements, of multiple experiments, and no necessarily organised front, of a counter-discourse of economy that marshals these instances into a powerful meshwork. But in the Community Economies Collective, and of course outside it, many questions have been raised about, and here I'm quoting from one of the papers in our special collection written by Ethan Miller, questions have been raised about the near emptiness of a community economy meta-ethic. And doubt has been cast upon its effectiveness as a political strategy for building community economies. And in his paper, Ethan speculates on the reluctance to formulate a set of values to guide organisational strategy for the community economy, and wonders whether there are limits to the analogy between feminist and radical economic movements. The Solidarity movement, for example, in comparison, articulates its material and institutional form through a defined set of shared values and an explicit focus on constructing new material conditions of viability for alternative economic practices through concrete connections. And this is a map that I think comes from Maliha's work on mapping the solidarity economy in New York City. And some members of the Community Economies Collective have got a new grant to start to expand this work with others. I think some of them are here in the audience as part of that research work. So, I mean, in comparison to the solidarity economy that has a clear set of values, Ethan raises this question about the emptiness, to some extent, of the community economy's conception. And I want to use Ethan's questioning of the limits of a feminist imaginary of possibility as a prompt to begin to develop further a vision of collective action for community economies. And rather than taking up the option of prescribing a set of values for community economies, something that Julie and I were very careful to sidestep, and I think that many of us in the collective don't necessarily advocate, I want to consider how we might still work with constructing new material conditions of viability for community economies in different ways. The engagement of community economy thinking with actor network theory, or material semiotics, has seen a flourishing of research on just this topic. Many researchers in the Community Economies Collective are making an attempt to widen membership of the collective, to dislodge the centrality of human agency, to see actancy as distributed across the hybrid collective or assemblage, and to develop technical devices that increase the viability of community economies. In a recent essay on our new book, Take Back the Economy, geographer Jeff Popke commented that it contained tools for rescuing those economic practices that are threatened with extinction by the calculative rationalities of capitalism. And this phrase, threatened with extinction, struck me at the time. It's taken from Michel Caron's essay, What Does It Mean to Say That Economics is Performative? Caron and others have been working to question the pre-ontological status of the market and the supposition that it operates by causal necessity. Their Latourian-inspired approach to the performativity of economics aligns itself with work that we've done, but in contrast to our focus on promoting the performative effects of new discourses and subjectivities, this work directs attention to the performative materiality of the economy as expressed in technologies, metrics, infrastructures, institutions, and what he calls calculative agencies. Research has focused on the active engineering of socio-technical assemblages, or agencements, that allow markets to perform as they do. In this approach, economic discourse and human subjectivity are but two members of complex socio-technical assemblages that make markets. This doesn't negate, I think, the kind of interventions that Gibson Graham advocates or has made for making other worlds possible, but it is a kind of salutary reminder of what we're up against. The term extinction, I think, is a powerful one because it places non-capitalist economic practices in some kind of shared space with living species, including humans, whose life is threatened, not by representational strategies, but by the impact of human existence as we've come to know it in the Anthropocene. The strong scientific consensus about global warming has catapulted a new matter of concern onto the political landscape, and we are being asked to think about the future as a species, as Dipesh Chakrabarty has written. At the same time, the conviction that humans are located at the centre of political processes of change has been thoroughly shaken by the increasing realisation that we may not be able to control the forces that have been unleashed by 200 years of fossil fuel burning. Species extinctions are accelerating as global warming proceeds unchecked, and climate uncertainty intensifies. For many of us, it's clear that it is time for humans to, in the words of Val Plumwood, find new ways to live with the earth. ways that will help us to rework ourselves and our high energy, high consumption and hyper-instrumental societies adaptively. But there's much to suggest that the very materiality of our society stands in the way of such change. One of the criticisms of actor network theory's research into economic performativity is that it contributes to a sense of impossibility. Research in this vein has largely focused on orthodox definitions of markets elaborated by neoclassical economics. By documenting the durability of material semiotic assemblages of capitalist economic relations, the potential emergence of other economies is diminished. And this has been an interesting subject of debate by people like Judith Butler, who's started to think about how her work has been taken up in the economic sphere, and Daniel Miller, who's been quite critical of Michel Callon's work. And in his essay, Callon's essay in our new book, Performing Diverse Economies, he makes an interesting defence of his work, which I think is quite convincing. But rather than going into that, I think we need to reflect on this issue. Clearly, it is a hard ask to both map out the socio-technical assemblages that act to make economies and markets as we know them more real or durable, and at the same time to be open to the performativity of new ways of enacting economy. This tension, I think, is evident in Timothy Mitchell's new book, Carbon Democracy, that documents the fossil fuel-based socio-technical assemblages that have shaped democratic politics over the last century and a half. What we've come to know as organised politics, Mitchell argues, has been intricately connected with and shaped by the socio-technical controversies surrounding coal, oil and uranium. Central to his argument, to Mitchell's argument, is the role of technical expert knowledge of the economy to the way that the politics of oil has shaped our contemporary lives. He writes, innovations in methods of calculation, in the use of money, the measurement of transactions, and the compiling of national statistics made it possible to imagine the central object of politics as an object that could expand without any form of ultimate material constraint. In the 1967-74 crisis, the relations between these disparate elements were all transformed, and he argues they're being transformed again in the present. Today, we see a desperate push to extend the life of fossil fuels by redefining nature as man-made, so as to exploit what's called unconventional oil and gas. So we see the push for the mining of oil shale and extraction through cracking, and the mining of oil sands and coal gas, seam gas via hydraulic fracking. And as we saw with Jono's hoax, we see fitful breakdowns of the socio-technical assemblages of carbon economy formation. Mitchell's Carbon Democracy is a very interesting book, and it ends at the present. This perilous moment when both our democracies and our undemocracies are unable to act around climate change and global poverty and wealth distribution. To me, or for me, the performative effect of this book, probably wasn't an intended one, is to make a politics of possibility much less real. Yet in the last few pages of his book, Mitchell issues the obligatory call for another world, and in so doing, I think, offers us something to work with. He writes, building solutions to energy future needs is also the building of new forms of collective life. But the form and membership of the collective is up for question. He asks, with what forces, human and non-human, do we want to form alliances? To what powers do we want to subject ourselves? He concludes, the possibility of more democratic futures depends on the political tools with which we address the passing of the era of fossil fuel. Well, these are provocative questions that prompt further thought about how to develop a conception of collective action around community economies in the Anthropocene. In Take Back the Economy, we offer counter-calculative technologies for enacting more than capitalist worlds. As Jeff Poppy noted, we rescue those economic practices that are threatened with extinction by the extinction through the calculated rationalities of capitalism. And we propose a set of other kinds of tools, including all sorts of charts and diagrams depicting diverse economies, as well as checklists, scorecards, regs, inventories and yardsticks meant to disentangle and re-envision what we mean by well-being, by surplus, by investment, by supply chains, commons and other dimensions of the economy. These are political tools designed to measure and expose our interdependencies with each other and earth others. In the book, we document examples of actually existing collective actions that attempt to negotiate ethical outcomes around one or more dimensions of interdependence. Our aim is to show that we already have the ethical calculative agency to build new forms of collective life. Of course, these agencies need to be supported and made viable by a vast range of socio-technical devices, policies and laws, infrastructure, scientific know-how, cultural practice, to name just some. So in this last section of the lecture, I want to take up Timothy Mitchell's call for different energy futures and tentatively proceed to gather technical devices that offer new opportunities to act on our interdependence and make community economies more viable. So first, solar citizens. In Australia, over the last decade, there's been a rapid uptake by households of photovoltaic solar panels that generate electricity. A series of government programs stimulated this uptake: cash rebates on purchasing and installation of solar panels, renewable energy certificates, and guaranteed tariffs on energy feedback into the grid. During the global financial recession, the Australian Federal Labor Government provided further cash handouts to promote the installation of home insulation that complemented this renewable energy push. In a few years, 1 million solar systems were installed in Australia, a country of 23 million people, and the cost of panels reduced to a quarter of their 2002 price. As the government rebates became increasingly means-tested under criticisms that they are a form of middle-class welfare, the uptake of solar panels in poorer areas has been remarkable. In Sydney, the outer edge municipality of Blacktown, which is one of the poorest and most multicultural areas in the metropolis, is now the solar energy epicentre. With the decline of government subsidies, new mechanisms for accessing solar energy have sprung up. For example, the Californian-based company SunPower offers free installation to Australian households and a financing arrangement with a local credit union that allows for the system to be paid off over 10 years from savings on energy bills and the selling of excess power to the grid. A new political collective has formed around solar power. Solar Citizens is a community project that brings together existing and future solar owners to ensure the rights of solar owners are protected and to see Australia put a panel on every rooftop, as their website says. At one level, it's a small producers movement, a collective of investors in the million rooftop power stations who have put over $8 billion to date of their own money into clean energy generation. They're wary of the big energy companies who don't want to see Australians take back control of their own energy needs, they write. At another level, it's a citizens' movement that protects the right of solar owners and lobbies the government in the face of declining or intermittent support. And most recently, Solar Citizens have mobilised to force the West Australian state government to back down on its decision to slash the feed-in tariff. It's interesting that the identification with solar is something that appears to cross all political allegiances. Solar energy prosumers, producers and consumers, are exercising new calculative agencies that make visible their interdependence with a variety of human and non-human others. With the sun and its daily and seasonal rhythms, the technologies of solar capture and their financing, with the national energy grid and its demands and pricing fluctuations, and with their household energy use. In a reality TV program, The Carbon Cops, which was broadcast on public TV in 2007, a sample of households were issued with energy monitors to measure their consumption in real time. The average Australian household emits 14 tonnes of carbon emissions per year, and all the households selected were very far over this figure. So they helped the household to monitor where were their carbon emissions largely coming from. They installed these little monitors that showed green when the household's usage was within the national average of carbon emissions and turned shades of red when it exceeded this amount. And households were challenged to reduce their carbon footprint to at least or below the national average. And they were then helped to make their homes more energy efficient and their practices less wasteful. Over the 6-week period of the program, they tried changing their behaviour under the watchful eye of the camera. And this process is being replicated all over Australia as new habits are being learnt and new calculative abilities developed. From the perspective of community economy concerns, we can see the current and future well-being of the planet being put into the same calculative frame as the well-being of households. Secondly, solar cooperatives. In the context of the declining manufacturing and heavy industry employment in Australia, a group of unionists has embarked on a very different kind of production experiment linked to the renewable sector. They formed the Earthworker Cooperative, Australia's first workers' cooperative for green manufacturing. Inspired by the worker cooperative movement in the US, this is the first contemporary attempt by the Australian labour movement to challenge private ownership and establish cooperatively owned businesses. The plan is to build union-supported, worker-owned and controlled cooperatives, manufacturing solar hot water units and ultimately the full range of green technologies. And here we see a very promising initiative coming from the labour movement, which for so long has fought for membership benefits with very little regard to the long term. The business model for this venture includes an interesting marketing and distribution strategy that combines diverse economic practices. Solar hot water systems will be included as an in-kind wage payment in negotiations between unions and employers as part of enterprise bargaining agreements. And as they write on their website, this facilitates the collective purchase of goods by workers, enabling them to start bringing their cost of living down by the use of solar power, cutting carbon emissions and supporting Australian manufacturing jobs that never leave our shores. The Earthworker Initiative enrolls a worker-owned cooperative business model that ensures democratic discussion of how surplus will be distributed. And we could start to record the kind of decisions that are being made on a kind of people's account of enterprise. And this is an example from our book, which is doing it for a different cooperative, not the one I'm talking about. Some of these distributions of surplus will flow to unions and employers as an incentive for opening their enterprise bargaining agreements in a way which provides a better-than-cash arrangement to workers. Some surplus will flow back to the cooperative to invest in more work and research that funds research and development, and 5% will go towards social justice projects, including to assist low-income families and older citizens to install solar hot water systems in partnership with the Uniting Church. The Earthworker experiment is fashioning socio-technical assemblages that are making community economies more viable. And lastly, solar economy. In July 2010, the University of Melbourne's Energy Research Institute published the Zero Carbon Australia Stationary Energy Plan. It outlined a 10-year roadmap for 100% renewable energy in Australia. The report was researched and written by a collaboration of academic researchers and Beyond Zero Emissions, a not-for-profit research and education foundation that was formed in 2006 with the goal of helping to facilitate a timely transition to a zero-carbon future where atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations are reduced to a safe threshold. This report inspires a radically different economic imaginary with its detailed costings of strategies to make Australia self-sufficient in renewable energy by 2020. It shows how baseload energy could be supplied by the development of wind power and concentrating solar thermal power with molten salt storage at a cost of 3% of GDP over 10 years, or $8 per household per week. The technical expertise gathered in these reports is impressive, but so is the strategy for getting its message out to the general public. Based on Al Gore's The Climate Project, Beyond Zero Emissions is a hybrid research collective in which technical experts and an army of volunteer citizen scientists develop and popularise knowledge about possible energy futures. This is an intervention that educates the public about economic modelling and enrolls individual prosumers with their distributed rooftop power generators into a national energy imaginary. In the days of Keynes and Kuznets, the national accounts were devised as an interdependent grid that tracked myriad inputs and outputs of traded goods. As Mitchell argues, a system of accounting for every instance of money changing hands performed the economy as an object in an unprecedented way. Could we see these new methods of generating and accounting for renewable energy use, modelled in the Beyond Zero Emissions report, as scoping out another economic imaginary? Can we glimpse a different performative object in which transactions, including most importantly the gift of solar power, weave together distributed and centralised networks into an economy of interdependence that honours the needs of the planet and Earth others, as well as humans? According to some, slowly but surely, renewable energy is eating into the business model of the fossil fuel burning energy generators. The market for renewables is growing as prices for solar panels drop, and new business models, like the one of the Earthworker Cooperative, for financing installations and distributing products are being developed. But there are many more elements in the complex socio-technical assemblages that are bringing this new energy sector into being. A language of the community economy that articulates concerns for more than human interdependence is an important actant in these world-making performations, as are the collective subjects that are being produced through the collaborative and cooperative practices of solar citizenship and solar accounting. And this is our attempt in the book to start to put together many of the concerns of the community economy into a kind of community economy return on investment model. So, just to conclude then, over the years that we worked closely together, Julie and I learnt to live with not knowing. And this wasn't easy in an intellectual and political environment that privileges strong theory, that privileges evidence-based outcomes, and confident posturing that can draw money from granting agencies. As a collective of two, we stumbled along, laughing, and we did a lot of that, listening to each other as we expressed muddled ideas, intuitions, and reactions. We opened to our ignorance and willingly became students many times over to overcome it. We spurred each other along to be adventurous, enticing ideas out of each other, and encouraging an audacity that probably got us into trouble at times. We started where we are, where we were, with what was at hand, piecing together fragments to fashion a way forward. I remember an artist that we met during our visit to the Havens Centre in Madison, Wisconsin, at the invitation of Eric Wright in the early 1990s, commenting that there were two types of cook: those who made a shopping list of ingredients to be procured before starting to cook, and those who opened the cupboard and cooked with what was there. And she saw us as the latter, and we often recalled this observation and reflected on the kind of creativity that was needed to cook from the cupboard, so to speak, not from the list. This was, for us, being the revolution. Not much to go on, I agree. Our project of bringing community economies into being has proceeded by reading the future into the present, by finding the ethical actions that enact interdependence within the diverse, more than capitalist economy that is already here in the cupboard, so to speak. So in this lecture, I've suggested that we open to the ways that socio-technical assemblages actualise collective action. This recourse to materiality and its political potential could seem like a step away from Ethan's challenge to propose a mode for community economy organising, but I'd like to suggest that it offers another way forward. In recognising our human capacity to not act, and the capacity of socio-technical assemblages to act, might we humans realign ourselves in the spatiality of collective action? Might we move out of centre stage and learn to act with both human and non-human others, negotiating our being in common in ways that enhance well-being for all. In a wonderful new book that was just published earlier this year by George Henderson, a geographer, called Value in Marx, George writes, "What sense is there in denying the ample evidence that people have the capacity to experience extraordinary joy and pleasure in working with each other, simply because they are working together? The giddy sensation that one is smaller than what one thought, part of a whole, and larger than what one is, stripped of individual fetters. That one has become folded, along with others, into a new creature altogether." When I first read this passage to prepare for a book panel around George's book earlier this year, I, of course, immediately thought of the fun of being J.K. Gibson Graham. And the incredible pleasures of working in the Community Economies Collective. But in the context of the argument in this lecture, I think it offers also a way of seeing ourselves in the more than human collective that acts, folded together in a new creature altogether. Thank you.
So we do have time for questions, and we were hoping to take questions in a batch of 3. So if anyone has any questions, please come up to the mic that's over there. It should be on. It could be comments as well. That's true.
So I just want to say, hi, I'm Linda Smirchik. I'm a faculty member here. I don't know if this is making any loud sounds or not.
You may want to turn that mic on.
Okay. I probably can talk loud enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say, as a member of the faculty at UMass Amherst for some 30 years, it has been beautifully inspiring to be in the same place where J.K. Gibson Graham has done her work. We appreciate so much what you've done, the way that you've inspired us to think differently. It's even reaching in the School of Management.
Thank you. Kat just said maybe we should just sing.
I probably will have to turn the microphone on. Very soft voice. I don't think I see the what?
Maybe on that, closer to the mic part of it. How about this one?
Is this on now? No. All right, I'll just try to talk loud. I really like this idea of renewable energy, and I am a faculty member at the University of South Carolina. Okay. I'm a faculty member at the University of South Carolina, and about 2 months ago, we had a wonderful initiative by some, I can't remember the name of the organization, but they were going to provide for very low cost for solar panels for nursing homes and institutions like that that would have both lowered carbon emissions and lowered the cost of providing energy for these institutions. And the South Carolina Electric and Gas Corporation blocked that, they're doing that by saying, you are not, if you're going to be a utility, then you have to be regulated as a utility. And it was really infuriating because, number one, it's a different situation. The reasons that utilities are regulated are well known among economists. I don't have to repeat them here, but not one economist in my institution or anywhere else in South Carolina got up and rebutted that argument, and the politicians completely caved in, which was no surprise to any of us on the left who live in any part of South Carolina. I just wondered if you had any suggestions on how to fight that kind of really naked corporate power and acquiescence by institutional economists who are, in my opinion, cowards. Sorry, can't help it.
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't think I have any answers for you here. I'm sure other people in the group might have some strategies, though. But I do see a very interesting opening, though, for those of us interested in different kinds of economic futures. I think, one of the big areas of lack has been the kind of alternative econometrics that we could be using to try and map out these futures. So I do feel that those of us with economic training and econometric training could easily be used to try and generate different kinds of scenarios, just like the Beyond Zero Emissions group have. And they're largely engineers, but they've obviously incorporated quite a lot of economists into it. And I think we can't underestimate the fact that those more technical imaginaries will really help people see something different. Just for me, reading that report and imagining that in 2020 we could be totally 100% renewable in Australia was a revelation. I mean, it won't happen, but it does. The fact that it could is something very interesting, and the fact then that these solar citizens have emerged out of the blue in more recent times, I think, is an interesting thing. So I do see there is a role. There's a lot of work to be done in a more technical mode to try and do this kind of alternative work, and we probably, we haven't taken up that challenge to do as much as we could be doing, because we're in these tried and true kind of old modes of doing public policy and staying within the grounds that have been set for us. So, yeah, that's my answer.
Thank you very much. It was a lovely talk as usual. Never disappointed on that aspect. Just wanted to push you a little bit on what the notion of the commons that you're using here. As you know, this Bart calls this a signifier without breaks in contemporary critical discourse right now. Could you differentiate it a little bit from, for instance, Negri's or Viano's notion, which to my mind and to others would be a teleological, would be a historicist movement based on the reading of Socialization and Marx, towards an inevitable ground of the commons. It doesn't seem, I suspect yours isn't like that, but if you could expand, if you could expand on that a little bit, it would be great. It'd be interesting for me.
Well, I can also enroll Stephen to help me on this. I guess I can talk about how we've tried to think about the commons in Take Back the Economy, the book. And really, we're using it in taking back the notion of property, because property itself is really relationships to things. So we try and get away from the object of property and talk about what are the social relationships around things like that we call property, whether it's intellectual property, cultural practices that's privatised or made into property, or actual land and houses and so on. And so what we do in the book is to try and show that, a commons is something that is made and shared by a community, and a community takes responsibility, benefits from commons, cares for it, stewards it, and so on. And there's lots of different ways that we can see forms of property in our environment that is common. It may be privately owned, but it's still common in the sense that people might share it, take responsibility for it, and use it and benefit from it. So we try and break away from this idea of private, non-private property as dominating the analysis, and we try to move towards this notion of commoning as a process of building relationships to property where it's explicit who is responsible for it, who is benefiting from it, who is sharing it. And that can include then, of course, a community of more than human, because much of the commoning that's needing to be done at the moment is with other species and in their name. So I guess in terms of, it's not this grand kind of more abstract commons that at Heart and Negri are talking about, but I think there's probably, would be some interesting conversations to be had there around the difference in which the ways in which we're proceeding. At the moment, it's very much more a how-to. Like we ask people to do a commons identikit and look at their own trajectory through time and space. And I've been thrilled to see some of the artists in New York City using our identikit to try and identify the spaces that they use in common in the process of enacting their practice. So there's Caroline there. And she's even added to our identikit the different kinds of participation that take place as communities start to use that. So it's a very practical kind of thing, but it is allowing us to talk about all sorts of property. In the book we talk about the struggles that have happened around the commoning of the breast cancer gene, for instance, and the way, interesting, one group of researchers and corporations wanted to make it private, and it's been obviously a subject of a lot of litigation at the moment. But the more we can make these concepts kind of understandable to people, the more I think we can enroll people in this notion of acknowledging that we are always already part of and participating in commons, and of course our atmospheric commons is the most potent one, and we need to start taking care of it, So that's kind of how we use the term.
Thanks for your comments. I do take issue with this idea that somehow this is a democracy and these things can be brought forward within the current society. I've been promoting this one quote from Bob Bacon: the essence of what exists in the U.S. is not democracy but capitalism. I wanted to give two examples related to what you're talking about. One having to do with the fossil fuels and just this phenomenon that the number one consumer of fossil fuels in the world, I believe, is the U.S. military. And what they're doing around the world is not based on any will of the people, but it has to do with the interests of an empire, what they've done devastating millions of lives in the Middle East, and even with this re-imaging with Obama, continuing to act as a predatory beast to the planet, has nothing to do with any kind of democracy. Another example has to do with New York City, because you referenced New York City as somewhat of a model for alternative institutions. What's happened to the black and brown youth in New York City? The mass incarceration, the stop and frisk, hundreds of thousands a year are stop and frisk based on skin color, the brutal murders with no recourse, and many of us were jolted by what happened to Trayvon Martin. But this is commonplace for so many black and brown youth. This is not because of some kind of democracy. This is a dictatorship of the capitalist class in America and what they're doing globally to the planet, to the people. I'm not questioning your motives in any way, or anybody in this room. Just the reality of capitalism itself is the barrier that needs to be uprooted. Now, maybe in the past you reached a point where you believe revolution was off the table. I'm trying to put it back on the table.
Yeah. Well, just I guess to start at the end, I guess I'm not trying to show up New York City as a model at all. I'm just trying to show a map of where some solidarity economy activities are within that spatial context. And I'm not trying to defend democracy in any way or even argue that America is a democracy. When I talked about democracy, I was really referring to the arguments of Timothy Mitchell, who asks us to think about the nature of what we call democracy that's emerged and how it's been so implicated in carbon politics. So I think the analysis of the rise of the military in the US is very much part of his story of the way in which oil and the whole relationship to the Middle East has been kind of orchestrated and managed and so on. So, and I can't really rehearse all the aspects of his argument there, but I guess where he's ending is to kind of agree with you that there isn't such a thing as a democracy at all, and that what we call democracy has totally failed. And you know, I mean, Australia, you know, what we call a parliamentary democracy at the moment is totally unable to take any kind of real action. So I guess where we come to differ, or where we perhaps might have different strategies for taking us forward, is to whether we then map on this kind of political system to capitalism as such, or the capitalist class, or whether we do work of trying to unpack the kind of socio-technical assemblages that are there. And one could easily spend one's time demonstrating your point, I think. One could argue that the whole media is becoming more and more dominated by the Rupert Murdochs of the world, whose work feeds into interests of the coal corporations, etc. And I think we could come up with a very powerful story that would justify your argument. And I guess personally, I've found that you know, I need a different way of approaching the world in order to carve out the space to feel that there is, it's possible to start to take action. And so the term capitalism is no longer meaningful to me. It's more, there are capitalist practices. There are a whole lot of powerful strategic political practices that I think are just bare power. I don't know how I would explain them economically. And obviously the military-industrial complex is a whole productive system in which there's a range of state actors and capitalist corporations that are in bed with each other. And yeah, I mean, one can go on in that analysis, but I guess from my point of view, I'm interested in these movements in the interstices that will start to perhaps cohere, who knows, because I just don't see how, you know, we're going to turn things around if we try and, you know, I don't know how to take on the US military, put it that way. It's a failure of my imagination, I'm afraid to say.
So I see 3 hands. Should we take all 3 at once?
Yeah, probably that's
This kind of follows on your point, I guess. And this is kind of an absurd, but I think very important question. You said that just at the end of your talk, or maybe it was answering those questions, the solar strategy plan for Australia was possible. It won't happen, but it's possible, you said. And it made me think that one of the things that, as an academic for a fairly long, or well, I don't know, it seems like a long time to me, since I had to write the longest dissertation in the world, that knowledge, information, and theory are often really toxic to the kind of possibility that is probably expressed in that plan. And so, after so many years of being able to say, hey, things are possible, wonderful things are possible, and yet sort of deliver that, and I would say mired in information theory and systems of knowledge. What sort of, how do you keep feeling that possible is truly possible? Sorry, maybe that's a very big question, but I'm still interested here.
So first, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm right here. So my question has to do first with quantity and inequality. So I think you very powerfully illustrated with the case of Jono how to do a very measured action against, corporate power, economic institutions, and you bring it all together really well. And I'm also interested in the type of qualitative transformations that you see the work and the practices doing, and not just sort of an amplification of intensity, which is maybe new intimacies and common and collections, but do you see there also being a threshold within the qualitative where there's a change in kind, or that it's the quality becomes something different? In particular, do you see there sort of threshold points that you think that would happen, so it's not just sort of you're on a journey, but you think that there's actually some major transformation or some bifurcation point sometime in the future.
I think there's one more. Yeah. So you know, please.
Thank you very, very much. As a long-standing reader, a very quick tribute. You know, I've always been able to hear Julie Graham's voice in yours, and yours in hers. And so this is a very alive evocation of the pleasures of co-authorship. And I think of co-authorship as itself a model for revising all kinds of relationships, co-authorship in the deepest, most sociable and most intimate sense. So you guys stand for me as a model of that. My question is direct. I'm just curious about whether or not in Australia, I heard you mention in the inventory of not so much new econometrics, but new measures of value. You made a reference to well-being, and then there's the emergence of a very public idea of the well-being agenda in the UK. I haven't heard it so much in the US. I'm wondering if it's taking shape in Australia and what its components are, and whether it has a kind of popular voice or resonance or uptake at this point.
Sorry. Okay, we'll take one more.
So my question is, this is something that I have a really hard time incorporating in the way you're thinking, because I really like the way you're thinking and the way you make me think about these issues, is that, for example, I see we stand with Jono behind, and I always am thinking about how we actually can also achieve some sort of security in these community economies where we're not being raided, or where we're not being persecuted, or where we're not being, attacked by other apparatuses that we are challenging. So this is one of the things that I am feeling more perplexed about. And I know, I've been in many solidarity networks, and it's helped me get through with these processes, but I'd like to hear how you would expand on this topic. Thank you.
Well, you've given me just some easy things to talk about. Well, first, Ted, I think my throwaway comment, it won't happen, isn't really right. I think it will happen, actually. It's not going to happen by 2020. I think some parts of it are already starting to happen. So I am confident that there is a change afoot, and that the fact that they've done that kind of work and the technology exists, that it is possible, it will probably start to happen. But I don't think it'll happen at the time frame that they're talking about. So I guess, what makes me see things as possible and truly possible is because you look back and you see how change has occurred. And, for Julie and I, feminism was always the kind of inspiration for the massive social changes that have occurred in my lifetime, my mother's lifetime, up to my grandmother's lifetime. And huge, incredible changes have occurred through a feminist movement, And so no matter how much we want to say, the men still aren't doing as much washing up as us, or all this kind of stuff, there have been dramatic social transformations in this period. And so that is, that gives you some sort of hope that change can occur. The classic example that often people talk about is just the change that's happened around smoking. People's habits have changed dramatically, and what we think of smoking now has changed. And that's in my lifetime, half of my lifetime. So the fact that we do change gives me hope that we can change. It doesn't mean that there's not a lot of struggle and violence, etc., on the way, or that there won't always be a world where those kind of things are happening. In terms of the quantitative and qualitative change issue, I think, I guess this is where a lot of people are being drawn to theorising complexity and this kind of thing. And I can see that that's a very helpful way of trying to see change and to identify these moments. And it seems to me that the moment that people are talking about now is just the pure kind of marketability of renewables. The fact that prices have come down so low, it is going to be, that's where the kind of economic rationality argument is kind of working for us to some extent. And there is a movement from a quantitative to a qualitative to a quantitative change to some extent, or a quantitative to a qualitative change. I mean, I remember my first boyfriend, who was a solar physicist, he came with me to graduate school but had to leave and go back and be a solar physicist in Australia. This was in the 1970s, working on new strategies for fracturing, metal sprays so that they would be able to absorb sunlight, etc., etc., etc. And it was like this weird, what on earth are you doing that for? It seemed a nice idea, but why do we need it, and etc., etc. And in that 33-year period where I switched a physicist for a social scientist, but drastic things have occurred. Now, how might we look at it in terms of that quantitative qualitative thing? I don't know, but I think it's a useful strategy, and it does happen. When you look at the way in which affects change so dramatically and can happen so quickly, I think. So again, I guess just by looking around, it gives me inspiration that those kind of processes that a lot of people have documented in different kinds of ways, obviously Marx talked about the same kind of thing, is going on. And it always sort of, I think back to Marx, visiting worker cooperatives and writing about them, saying how amazing they were at the time that he was also documenting what he saw as the rise of capitalism, even as he noticed that most people were still peasants. And you wonder, what would have happened if he'd started to focus on the rise of the worker cooperative movement at the time, rather than bring into being, in a way, through his wonderful work, the rise of capitalism. I don't know. It's an interesting hypothesis. But in terms of metrics and of well-being, Lisa, I think there is a discourse about this that's growing. And one of the other wonderful reality TV shows that I did a paper recently at a cultural studies conference where I got together all these reality TV shows that were actually about people enacting ethical lives. And one of them was about happiness, the happiness index, and they did this whole study of all of Australia and picked the unhappiest postcode and went in there with all their kind of, people talking about, work-life balance, health issues, relationships, financial budgeting and so on, and they got people to kind of work on this well-being, on all these different dimensions. I mean, the research is showing now that there's at least 5 or so different kinds of dimensions of well-being, not just material and economic, but social and psychological and physical, etc. And it was very highly, very watched, and it was an amazing kind of program. And I think more and more research is now coming out around this kind of issue, and it's coming into conflict, of course, with the whole work-life, the wages and hours of work kind of discussion. But as feminists have been arguing for so long, people are working too long and not in the right kinds of ways. So there is, at the moment in Australia, we've got a Conservative government that's come in agreeing to have paid parental leave at the level of your salary that you were at when you had your baby for 2 years. So that's an incredible thing for a Conservative government to say they're going to fund. So I think there is an opening here. I mean, I think, the work-life balance, in Australia, the union movement fought for a 35-hour week. The miners were at the front of that movement in the 70s, and they won it. And ever since then, people have been working more and more and more, and they're working like 60 hours a week. So there's a weird kind of thing that's happened, and the effects that it's having on communities and families and on health is dramatic. And so this is a real opening, I think, for a different kind of discourse around how do we work, how do we spend our time, what do we really mean by well-being. So I do see it happening, and it probably is to some extent happening here too, but it's certainly happening in Europe a lot more. And to come to your question about, well, it was really a comment about the violence of living, really, and what do we do about it? Yeah, and I don't have an answer to that question except to say that working with others, acting on our interdependence and supporting each other is one way forward and is one way to counter and cope with, I think, the violences of our world, which are still as great as ever, and more so for many people than others. And those of us who are in privileged positions, I think, have a responsibility to realise that and start to and turn our work to, how do we increase well-being across the board? How do we think about the person that made, that piece of clothing that you're wearing? And this is part of what our book's about, is trying to look at the encounters that we have through an economy that tries to mask those encounters. How do we start to bring that more present and start to care for each other and distant others as well as non-human others in a violent world? So I don't have any answers, but I have a process, I suppose, and I have some glimmers of thought of how to go ahead with it. Thank you.
I'd just like to thank you all for coming, and also say that there's a reception on the 10th floor of the campus center that starts at 8:30. So please join us. Thank you.